No, can't.
Hi,
There we go.
welcome.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us today for the Archaeology of Exodus with David Ilan. My name is Joy Alice Eisenhower, and I'm the Director of Arts for Boulder JCC. During this time of uncertainty, the Boulder JCC is focusing on one of our core strengths, being a community convener. If you need anything at all from virtual learning and fun to locating a restaurant that will provide takeout or delivery, or to figuring out how to do a virtual Passover next week, please go to our website at boulderjcc.org or feel free to reach out to us anytime directly. And if this is your first webinar, I'd like to take a quick minute to get you oriented to this format. First of all, on a webinar, you can just sit back and relax because you will not be on the camera today, nor will you have to worry about muting or unmuting yourself. Instead, we will just be using the Q&A button at the bottom of your navigation bar. You can ask a question at any point during the lecture, and David will try and answer as many questions as possible at the end of his presentation. If you have any technical issues, you can also ask for help on the Q&A, and we'll respond to you privately. Now, let's welcome David Ilan, the director of the Nelson Gulick School of Biblical Archaeology at the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem, where he specialized in mortuary archaeology, religion, and ritual. Since 2005, he has directed the excavations at Tel Dan in northern Israel, and fortunately for us, he is a visiting professor at CU Boulder Center for Study of Origins. We're so delighted to have you here today, David. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here. And we decided that this would be a good time to talk about the Exodus since Passover is rapidly approaching. So that's what we're going to do. As I said, it's complicated, so it's going to be a little bit difficult, but let's see, I want to share the screen here so you can see my presentation, and let's go. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Exodus, and we're going to talk about it from different angles: archaeology, text, Egyptology, and at the end you might have some questions. I'm sure you will. Be aware that I am an archaeologist, so my approach is more on the archaeology, but this is something that we all need to do together. If there's one lesson that we have learned, it is that when you talk about these complicated biblical questions, just text people, just archaeologists can't do it by themselves. It needs to be interdisciplinary. So I hope this talk will reflect that. You'll make your own decisions. Okay, so let's outline, first of all, what we're going to do today. So the first thing I'm going to do is just briefly go over the biblical narrative itself and the archaeology, and we'll see that something's not quite working very well. Then we'll talk about Levantines in Egypt in the second millennium BC. What were they doing there? When did they get there, etc. After that, we'll look at Egypt's role in Canaan in the Levant during the same time period. These things are going to come together later on. Then we'll segue into what happened at the culmination of Egypt's stay in Canaan. We'll talk about climate change a little bit, imperial collapse, fragmentation, and all the chaos that resulted from those things. And then we'll get into the new beginnings, circa 1100 BC or so. And the final goal is to try to figure out what really happened vis-a-vis the Exodus narrative. So first of all, let us review what the narrative says. Before I get into that, you need to know that there are actually multiple Exodus narratives like there are throughout the Hebrew Bible. There are apparently several authors. They are usually given names: the E writer, the J writer, the P writer, for Elohist, Yahwist, and the priestly or the Deuteronomistic writer, which is D. And so each of these writers very often has a portion of the text that is included. And what scholars of the Bible do is they try to separate those things out and to trace who did what, who wrote what. And they come together in various interesting ways, and sometimes they contradict each other. So that's something that you have to keep in the back of your mind. So a general outline of the Exodus story is, first of all, Joseph and his brothers and Jacob arrive in Egypt. The Israelites settle there and they prosper. After that, at the beginning of Exodus, a Pharaoh who doesn't know Joseph ascends to the throne, and then there begins a period of oppression of the Israelites. Moses is born, and he is put in the basket in the river, and he grows up in the Egyptian court. He becomes Egyptian for all intents and purposes. He kills an Egyptian overseer who is torturing Israelite slaves. He then escapes to Midian, marries Zipporah, who is the son of a Midianite priest, which is significant. Yahweh then reveals himself to Moses, and Moses is commanded to free the Israelites, and Aaron is sent along with him. Moses returns to Egypt. He advocates for the Israelites. The 10 plagues happen. Pharaoh finally relents, and the Exodus ensues with the parting of the Yam Suf, Yom Sof, depends how you write it. And then the Israelites are in the wilderness of Sinai, where you have the manna and water miracles, the mass revelation of Yahweh on Mount Sinai. The covenant code is delivered, the 10 commandments. And then there's a bad period where you have the worshiping of the golden calf, rebellion, apostasy, and where Yahweh exacts his anger partly by the hand of the Levites. After that, spies are sent out. There are encounters with the various peoples that are situated along the route to enter the land of Canaan. Edom, Midian, a battle with Amalek. And finally, Joshua is appointed the new leader, and Moses dies on Mount Nebo. So that's pretty much the outline. Of course, it's very sketchy what I've just given you, but that's the outline that we have to deal with. Okay, when did all this happen? The date of the Exodus in the text itself is given. It came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt. That is when Solomon's temple was inaugurated. So we have a very specific date for all of this in the book of Kings. And if you calculate that, it comes out to be around 1450 BC, which in archaeological terms would be late Bronze Age for the most part. Okay, so how does that work? Generally speaking, we're looking at a table of the archaeological periods. We're looking mostly at this slice of time, the late Bronze Age, the early Iron Age. Note that we're in the column that says claimed general equivalence. I wrote in red, careful, because you can't really do this. It doesn't really work. We used to think it worked, but it's a long time already that we know that it doesn't really work this way. But generally, this is the sequence of the archaeological dates and sort of the way they might fit in with the biblical text. Okay, so for one thing, there's a problem with the place called Pi Ramesses in the text. This is the place where, one of the places where the Israelites were engaged as slaves and had to build buildings and mix bricks, and they were very much in a bad way. Pi Ramesses is something actually we know the site from Egyptian literature. It was a site that was set up in the 19th dynasty, about 1300, 1290 or so BCE. It became very active circa 1270 in the time of Ramses II for political and strategic reasons. And it was established at around this time. So this already does not work with the chronology of the biblical text. It should have happened, this place should have existed a long time before. So we already have a chronology problem here as far as one of the places, the key places in the beginning of the Exodus narrative. There's another problem, and that is that if there are supposed to be 2 million Israelites in Egypt at this time, the fact of the matter is there is no evidence for Israelites in the New Kingdom of Egypt at all. They're just not there anywhere. And we have quite a few texts from Egypt from this time, and they're not anywhere. And of course, not 2 million of them. So another problem is in the Exodus narrative, when the Israelites leave, you would have thought that they would take the coastal route, the closest or the nearest way to get to the land of Canaan. But they don't do that because, as we are told in the book of Exodus, the Philistines they are settled in the area that blocks the Israelites' way, and those 2 million Israelites are afraid of those Philistines there. So they don't go that way. And the fact of the matter is, that's where we find the Philistines archaeologically. This is their heartland. Really, it would block the way of a group of people coming through. We also know that along the Mediterranean coast of Sinai, there's a series of Egyptian forts from the New Kingdom, from the same time period, and the Israelites also would have encountered them. It's possible, by the way, that Philistines manned part or some of them as well. So that probably wouldn't be a good way to go unless you're 2 million people and you can overcome anything. So this route is not taken by the Israelites. And so they decide to take that route way down through southern Sinai, through the high mountains of Sinai, and then up through the area of Midian and Edom and Moab, and then into the land of Israel. And this takes 40 years. Okay, so they're 40 years in the desert, and the book of Numbers is called the book of Numbers because it is a census of the number of people who were on this journey and spent 40 years in the desert. And according to the book of Numbers, you count the fathers' houses, so let's say small families, and there are supposed to be 600,000 and 3,550. This comes out to be at least 2 million people. So the question then becomes, so there's 2 million people, can we find them along that route? By the way, the Levites were not numbered among them, which is sort of an interesting thing. We'll come back to the Levites later. So 40 years in the desert. Here's a piece of the Sinai desert. Looks like that. Archaeologists for many years now have been doing surveys of the Sinai, several of them. Here's what a survey looks like in archaeology. A bunch of people spread out along the space that you're going to survey, and you look for sherds, you look for architecture, all kinds of things that's archaeological. And by spacing yourselves in this way, let's say every 20 or every 50 meters, you're going to find most of what there is to find in a particular area. And this has been done in Sinai, not everywhere, but to a significant extent. There's also been quite a few excavations in Sinai. In various places, a few tens of excavations over the years. So it's not like this is terra incognita. Here, for example, is a map from an article written by Yitzhak Beit Aryeh in the 1980s, where we see just prehistoric sites in Sinai. These are just sites that go up to about 3000 BC, no later. Here's a map of sites, just ritual sites, cultic sites in part of the Sinai desert. There's a whole bunch of those too, together with the routes that they go with. There are also some Egyptian sites in the Sinai. The Egyptians were mainly interested in exploiting the turquoise in the desert. And they set up a very important mining area at a place called Sarabit al-Khadin. And they set up a temple to the goddess of the mines, whose name is Hathor. So here is her temple. And there are a few other sites around this that have to do with the mining. So if we look at the map of Sinai from the 2nd millennium BC, we have those forts along the coastal route. We have several sites that are associated with the turquoise mines, maybe some copper mining too. And that's it. There's nothing else. There are no other sites in the desert. If there were 2 million people hanging out here for 40 years, you would have found something, and there isn't anything. And that is a big problem. Here's another problem. The first time we hear about Israel is in a standing stone that was found in Egypt that was left by the king whose name is Merneptah, circa 1207 BCE, could be a couple years later. And in this stone, we are told about Merneptah's military expedition into the Levant, where he overcomes a series of enemies, rebels, towns that have rejected the Egyptian suzerainty. And among other things, Israel is laid waste and his seed is not. There is the word Israel that's been magnified from the text. And at the end of the word Israel is this determinative, which is a man, a woman, and 3 lines underneath, which tell us that this is a people. This is the group of people, circa 1207 BC, that are already resident in the land of Israel, in Canaan. And this is, by the chronologies that are now people are working with, this is sort of early. In other words, this is actually, the Exodus should have happened right about this time, but Israel's already there. So that is also a bit of a chronological problem. Okay, now let's shift gears a little bit and let's look at Levantines, Western Asiatics in Egypt. Here's a picture of Joseph and Pharaoh. One of the most eloquent pieces of art that we have depicting Canaanites or Levantines in the world of Egypt is this painting from the tomb of Hunum-Hotep in Beni Hassan in Middle Egypt. It dates to about 1890 or so BCE, and it's very explanatory. You can see the Egyptians up here with their white kilts, and they are sort of leading the Canaanites or the Levantines up to, who are bringing all kinds of goodies that the Egyptians like and want. They have some wild animals. They're not domesticated, which is sort of interesting. This is the leader. His name is Ibshu, and he is Hekao Chesut. He is a ruler of foreign lands, so he's the leader of these people. And the vignette here is showing us the good things that these Levantines are bringing with them. And you can see that they have lots of weapons. They also have bellows, which means that they're good with metallurgy. Here is a lyre, so they sing really well and they have nice music. And one of the most striking things is the textiles, the clothing. Look at these beautiful patterns. The artist is telling us, wow, look at this haute couture. We really want these people here because they're bringing style. They have beautiful cloth and clothing that we want. This is a positive portrayal of immigration. These are immigrants that we want because they bring us good stuff and they bring us skills. So this is one aspect of immigration into Egypt from the Levant, very early on. Apparently this immigration leads to a taking over of northern Egypt eventually, circa 1650 or so BC, where the Levantine elements, the northerners, take over the northern part of Egypt, the Delta area, and a little bit further south. And they mix in with the Egyptians. You find a mixed material culture. There's a lot of assimilation. There's a bit of both, but they are the ones that are running the show, these Levantines. And they are called the Hyksos. It's a Greek version of the word Hekao Chesut, rulers of foreign lands. Their capital is located at a site called Avaris, which is located at a site that's been excavated by an Austrian expedition led by Professor Manfred Bitok and afterwards his students at Tel El Daba. Doesn't look like much when the squares are first opened up. It's very flat and the buildings are mostly made of mud brick, but it was a very, very impressive site. And once you excavate and start reconstructing things, these are the kinds of structures that existed at Tel El Daba. It was a magnificent city on the Pelusic branch of the Nile River with palaces and beautiful houses and lush agriculture and lots of trade that was coming up and down the Pelusic branch of the Nile, which is no longer there, by the way. So there's this fantastic kingdom, which is on the Pelusic branch of Asiatics, and the Egyptians didn't like this at all, because they also controlled some of the important products that they felt was necessary. For example, olive oil or wine that was coming from the Levant, it all had to come through the Hyksos, middlemen, and they didn't like that. It was more than just didn't like. This was a travesty in their eyes. So circa 1525 or so, the Egyptian dynasty, the heartland, got its act together and started fighting back. From this stela of this burial stela of Kamos, who was a general, we learn about how the Hyksos were laid siege upon in Avaris, and then had to run away. Here is the king who prosecuted that battle, Ahmes, and the Asiatics, the Levantines, had to leave from Avaris, and they ran to a place called Sharuchen. We happen to know Sharuchen from the Hebrew Bible, by the way, as well. So they ran off, and they ended up at Sharuchen, which is Tel Ajjul, as far as most scholars are concerned, which is a big site in the Gaza Strip with palaces and neighborhoods and a great deal of wealth. Here's one example of the palatial architecture, mostly again made with mud brick above stone foundations. And a series of hoarded treasures were found in the remains of Tel Ajjul. These are probably people that had run away or had socked away their valuables in the walls and floors of the houses when the Egyptians were laying siege on the Asiatics or the Levantines who were holed up at Tel Ajjul. In the end, the Egyptians were victorious and they went back. And after that, the Egyptians never let that happen again, and were not going to let that happen again. So one explanation for the Exodus narrative is that the story is somehow a memory of the Hyksos expulsion, of Levantine peoples who once controlled the Delta area. Think in terms of Joseph. By the way, they had a king whose name was Jacob. So that's an interesting sidebar. And the story of the Exodus is a memory of this Hyksos expulsion. That's one explanation. It has a little bit less currency now, but it's still out there. So now let's look at Egypt in Canaan, because this is also part of the equation. We know that already in the same time period, in the early part of the second millennium BC, the Egyptians are active in Canaan. This, for example, is the Chusobek stele, which depicts a military expedition into the hill country to pacify bandits or people who are creating problems with the trade routes. Among other things, they go up to a place called Shechem, which is probably Shechem of the Hebrew Bible. There are also documents that are called execration texts, and these take the form of sort of voodoo dolls like this, or bowls that have incantations on them with the names of Levantine towns and rulers. And the idea is that you write these and you curse them and you break them, and that is supposed to create some kind of magical action to help you in your defending yourselves against these rambunctious Asiatics, Levantines, who create a lot of problems for trade. The Egyptians were very interested in maintaining open trade routes with the Levant, again, specifically for wine and olive oil products. So we don't know for sure to what degree the Egyptians controlled this area. We have governors' statues, but they're usually broken up, and we're not sure if these were given later as gifts, or maybe they actually did depict governors that resided in Canaan. It's still an open question. Most people think they didn't have direct control over Canaan, that these came later. Here's an interesting find from Tel Hatzor not too long ago, a piece of a sphinx that comes from that site. It's an earlier version, by the way. So this is something that ended at some point, this kind of relationship, which was sort of symmetrical. with the expulsion of the Hyksos. And from that point onwards, the Egyptian exploitation of Canaan was more asymmetrical. After the expulsion of the Hyksos, the Egyptians established strongholds in several key places and maintained periodic booty expeditions into the southern Levant in order to take stuff and leave. And they left their outposts in several places. And the background of all of this, and this is something we have to remember, is this is a time period, the late Bronze Age, when the kingdoms are arrayed around the Eastern Mediterranean, and there's sort of this balance of power between them. Lots of trade going on between them, but people are also a little bit worried about each other, especially where the zones of contact are. The trade routes are critical here, and this is sort of a schematic portrayal of the way it worked. It worked in sort of a counterclockwise route according to the currents and the wind patterns by seasons, and goods reach different places as you follow these routes. One of the most famous illustrations of that are the Cypriot and Mycenaean imports that you find in all of these different places. Thousands of objects that got distributed throughout the Eastern Mediterranean by maritime commerce. And this famous shipwreck, the Uluburun shipwreck off the coast of Turkey, where thousands of objects, copper ingots, jewelry, scribal apparatus, agricultural produce, all the stuff is found in the bottom of the ship that had sunk in the ocean, and was found pretty much intact a number of years ago, and it illustrates this massive trade that took place between kingdoms in the late Bronze Age, circa 1400, 1300 BC. Egypt, of course, controlled Canaan by this time, and it actually viewed Canaan officially as part of Egypt. It wasn't just a colony, it was part of Egypt. After the initial phase of conquest and booty expeditions, Egypt established a different system whereby local rulers were co-opted, their children were brought to the Egyptian court, and then sent back again, knowing Egyptian lifeways to rule Canaan. And during this time, things went a little bit better, it seems, but in the 14th century BC, in the middle of the 14th century, there was a revolution in Egypt where a new king came to the throne, whose name was Amenhotep IV. He changed his name to Akhenaten, and he set up a new religion to the sun disk god Aten, and he built a new capital in Middle Egypt in the place that is now called Tel El Amarna. At Tel El Amarna, this huge building project was initiated. It was never finished because the capital was very short-lived. This religious and political revolution was not successful. But one of the outcomes of this is that an archive was stored at Tel El Amarna of several hundred documents written in Akkadian with letters that went back and forth between the Egyptian crown, mostly coming in from the Levant, from the various vassal kings and towns that were under Egyptian rule. And these tell us about how bad things are in the southern Levant, how the various petty kings are fighting each other, robbing each other, taking each other's territory, hiring warriors that are called Habiru warriors, and basically giving each other grief. And a lot of times you hear that these rulers are complaining that the king is not answering them. Sometimes they'll write 2 or 3 times saying, "Why didn't you answer me? I need help. Send me a couple chariots and some men." And there's no answer. So what we're seeing here in this period of El Amarna is a period of collapse, of negligence, of sort of things falling apart, and this is not good. At the end of the El Amarna period, there's a resurgence and a coup d'etat, and a general named Horemheb deposes the last 18th dynasty king, Tutankhamun, who you know very well, and reestablishes Egyptian control over its territory, particularly in Canaan. One of the main reasons this is critical is that there's an empire in the north, the Hittite Empire, which is making incursions into Egyptian territory and creating alliances with the border regions and very much threatening Egyptian control over the Levant. And so the now 19th dynasty kings, which include Seti I, Ramses II, start fortifying their positions, building new staging sites, and establishing a better control over the southern Levant. This culminates, by the way, in a great battle at a place called Tel Kadesh, which seems to have been a standoff, and very important agreements were made as a result. Part of the reassertion of control is the establishment of governors' residencies all throughout the southern Levant, all throughout what is Israel today, in all kinds of different places. This was sort of a surge. Here's a model of one of them from the Israel Museum at Tel Afek. Here's a whole bunch of plans of similar ones from all kinds of different places, from Tel Farah South, from Tel Afek, from Beit Shan, from Tel Masos. There's a whole bunch of them. The Egyptians inundated the country with forts and a military presence in order to assert control. They also buried their dead sometimes, or at least somebody did, in Egyptian-style coffins. These are from the Gaza Strip at a place called Dir el-Balach, a place that Moshe Dayan had an opportunity to, let's say, excavate. Anyway, a cemetery that belonged, now this is interesting information because Egyptians did not want to be buried outside of the homeland. So if Egyptians are being buried here, that means this is part of Egypt. One of the key centers of Egyptian control was Tel Beit Shan, which is now something a place that you can visit very easily. There's lots of Egyptian pottery at Tel Beit Shan. Actually Egyptian-style pottery, but it's made with local wares. So that means that there are Egyptian potters that are resident there. There's also an Egyptian residency. There it is. And even things like Egyptian-style barber tools or razor blades are found at Tel Beit Shan. These are not from Beit Shan, but a couple like this have been found there. So there's Egyptians there. And there are hieroglyphic stones, standing stones, from most of the 19th and 20th dynasty kings that tell us about the Egyptian rule, about how strong it was in this particular place. And also there are a couple of them that talk about belligerent elements in the countryside around that need to be suppressed by the garrison. So we know that there's trouble brewing in the countryside. In Beit Shan also, the Egyptians are burying their dead in Egyptian-style coffins, but in this particular case, the headdress here looks like it might even be a Philistine. I won't explain why right now, we don't have time, but that also hints perhaps that the Egyptians have hired foreigners to be part of the force to exert their control. They also are exploiting natural resources. Here's the site of Timnah in the south of Israel, just north of Eilat, where there are mines. And at the copper mines at Timnah, there is also a temple at the base of the cliff where we have, it's a Hathor temple because she's the goddess of mining. And so there's the aspect of Hathor. There's also what looks like a sort of local aspect because there are standing stones here, but there's a significant Egyptian element here, including lots of inscriptions. So we are told that all of this Egyptian control is very strong for a long time, but there are belligerent elements that need to be suppressed, and the Egyptians very actively do that. And the Merneptah stone is one of the references to that. In this case, several towns in Israel are the belligerents. At the end of this process, something bad starts happening in Egypt. The very intense control of the southern Levant begins to fray. For one thing, there is a climate crisis right now. We now know from various kinds of tests that are done in cores in the Dead Sea, in the Sea of Galilee, in the Hula Valley, also in Cyprus, in Syria, in Turkey, that this is a period of much more dry, much more drier climate. It's a period when that climate is creating famine. It's a period when this is leading to chaos. And this seems to be the cause of the chaos, the underlying cause, although there's probably other things going on. Lots of destruction layers in various places around the Eastern Mediterranean. There's piracy. People that used to live in various countries have now taken to the sea. They've become refugees, and they are creating a great deal of stress economically and politically throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. And the Egyptians are sort of by the by telling us that these things are happening. We hear about poor yields in crops. We hear about the same further north. The Hittites, some of their cities are abandoned, and they require shipments of grain from Egypt. So this is a time of collapse for environmental reasons, but also for the other things that are knock-on effects of that. And this culminates in the southern Levant circa 1140 BC when the Egyptians leave. They leave all their fortresses, all their sites. The people that they had brought in to be part of the suppressive group stay behind probably. Probably some of the Egyptians stay behind too. Where are they going to go? A lot of these people had intermarried with locals. And so what are they going to leave? There's not really anywhere where they can go. So by the time of Ramses VI, end of the 12th century BC, the Egyptians have gone for good. There might be some left, but they have gone. So the second explanation of the Exodus that has been suggested by several people is that the Egyptians were the oppressors in Canaan itself. And that especially is a product of the 13th century and 12th century BC. And that the Exodus memory has to do with this suppression, oppression, and eventually the Egyptians leave, and that was something to celebrate. And so that's another explanation that has been given in the past for the Exodus memory. So now we're going to talk about another aspect, a third interesting, intriguing possibility that has been raised more recently in the last decade or two by several scholars, and that will concern the Levites. So as we talked about before, in the 14th century, a new religion came about in Egypt that was established by the king Akhenaten, 14th century BC, where the sun disk god Aten was the god who was worshipped. Here's a picture of one of the Aten temples at Tel El Amarna, probably not finished. That sort of monotheism was tapped into by Sigmund Freud, of all people, in 1939. One of his last books was Moses and Monotheism, where Freud proposed that actually Moses and Mosaic religion emanated out of this Akhenaten religion that goes way back to the 14th century BC. At the time, the eminent archaeologist and scholar of the ancient Near East, William Foxwell Albright, sort of wrote, that's sort of an interesting idea. It's worth considering. But actually, after that, almost everybody thought that it wasn't going to play out. It didn't work chronologically. There wasn't enough evidence, and mostly people ignored it. It's sort of made a bit of a comeback in the last few years. But more recently, a couple other things have been written that sort of follow up on that. We'll leave it to the side for right now, but a somewhat different take. And here is an article from a very interesting, useful website called thetorah.com, which has all kinds of good stuff in it. And it is an article written by Professor Israel Knoll of the Hebrew University. And he writes about the Exodus and has a completely very specific take on the way he interprets the story. And he looks at, first of all, the Harris Papyrus, which was a papyrus discovered in the 19th century and purchased by a British guy named Harris, of course. It's the longest scroll that we have, dates to about 1150 BCE in the 20th dynasty. Here we have Ramses III paying obeisance to the triad of gods of Egypt. In any case, It's a very descriptive, very interesting papyrus scroll that talks about the history of the 20th dynasty from its establishment until circa 1150 BC. So Setnakhte, we'll talk about him in a second, Ramses III. It might have been written in the time of Ramses IV, we're not sure. The person who established the 20th dynasty after the collapse of the 19th dynasty was Setnakhte. And he's a guy who didn't rule for a very long time. We know about him from a few things. Among others, we have the stela of Bak and Honsu, which was found not too long ago. And so we have a little bit of information about him. And between the Harris Papyrus and his monuments, there's a couple of standing stones with descriptions in them. We get the following sequence of events. So in 1197 BC, this is the beginning of the 12th century, Seti II dies. He's the last king of the 19th dynasty. And then there's this guy named Chancellor Bey. Now Bey is a Syrian. He's very powerful, and he installs his man as the new king. The new king's name is Siftach. And Bey comes into bad graces with Siftach. He's executed because he's considered a traitor. So he's out of the picture. And Siftach dies a year later. And who takes over? The widow of Seti II, Taosret, who rules for about 2 years. She was originally the regent, perhaps, and then she takes over, and then she dies. And after she dies, somebody whose name is Irsu, which means self-made or upstart, takes over. He gains control in 1188, and he is a Haru. A Haru is a Syrian, someone from the north. So this sounds like the Game of Thrones. This is chaos. This is assassination. This is political machinations. Things are not going well in Egypt right now. And there are basically two camps. There are the native Egyptians, and as you can see here, there is a Syrian northern Levantine element which is vying for power. According to Israel Knoll, in his book, which is still only in Hebrew, I think a translation is coming out soon, if it hasn't already, Irsu is a Syrian, and he is Moses. And Knoll also suggests that this story that Manetho, the later Egyptian historian, is actually, this fits the account of the Hyksos that Manetho writes. We are told about Manetho's story from the Jewish historian Josephus. And the basic outline of the story sort of fits the Exodus story. And so Knoll thinks that Irsu is Moses. By the way, the name of Moses comes from the Egyptian word mes, which means son of. All the Egyptian kings, Thutmose, Amenemhes, Ramesses, all have that word in there. It means son of, like Jackson or Robertson. So it's a generic Egyptian name. It could almost be like calling someone Ben today. Ben in Hebrew means son. So according to Knoll's reconstruction, there's a power struggle between Levantines and a faction of native Egyptians. The Levantines lose, and they're forced to flee. The Levantines are not just slaves, they're armed and dangerous. They were in the game. They also include other groups, mercenaries. This is the meaning of the term Erev Rav, which is mentioned in the book of Exodus and a couple other places in the Hebrew Bible. It generally means foreigners, other ethnicities, and in this particular context, probably mercenaries. So, are we talking about oppression? Perhaps. At the very least, according to this scenario, we're talking about discrimination against foreigners and an attempt by those foreigners to take control of their destiny. And that failed. And this brings us to another take on the same time period with a similar sort of reconstruction. And this occurs in the book written by Richard Elliott Friedman a few years ago called The Exodus. It's a good read. It's a lot of fun. Not everybody agrees with everything in this book, needless to say, but it's a fun read. According to Friedman, the key here is the Levites. The Levites are very prominent in this story. The word Levi means to be attached or accompanying. So they're clearly not a part of something. And the question is, what are they not an integral part of? To what are they attached? Different people, scholars, have suggested different things. One approach is that they are attached to cult sites, to ritual sites in the land of Israel itself. And then after that, they transferred their roles to the temple and things that happened later on. That's one possibility. The other thing is that Moses and Aaron, of course, were Levites. Moses, whose name means the son of, is Egyptian. The Levite priests, Hophni and Pinchas, that occur a little bit later on, those are Egyptian names, and others may be too, Kohat, Merari. In fact, the word Miriam, the name, probably comes from the root Meri Amun, or Merit Amun, which means beloved of the god Amun. That's also an Egyptian name. So if anybody out there is named Miriam, you have an Egyptian name. These people are all Levites. They're very prominent in the text, in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and throughout. The Levites have some common themes. One of the things that are constantly, we're hearing about from the Levites and in association with them, but throughout the Hebrew Bible, biblical text, we are seeing in the text of the Hebrew Bible constant reminders that Yahweh brought Israel out of Egypt many, many times, all kinds of different junctures. It's a reason why you have to do all kinds of different things, because Yahweh brought you out of Egypt. Another thing that the Levites promulgate are the commandment to treat foreigners well. This is something that Friedman emphasizes. Why is this such a big deal? It's a big deal because the Levites themselves were foreigners, according to Friedman's understanding of the text. The Levites were foreigners in Egypt, probably Levantines themselves, who were resident in Egypt, who built up their own community, who had their own religion. Perhaps they were influenced by Atanism, we're not sure about that, but they were foreigners and they were not accepted in Egyptian society, and they were oppressed, and that was the reason that they left eventually. So, and when they came to Israel, they were also foreigners. They insinuated themselves, they made themselves part of Israeli or Israelite society, but they were still attached. They were foreigners. And so for the Levites to treat foreigners well is a critical part of the values that they are forwarding. They were the priests, so they're very concerned with ritual. That's why the book of Leviticus has so much ritual in it. It's written by and for Levites. Also, Exodus has a lot of priestly ritual activity in there. The whole tabernacle thing, the Ark of the Covenant, all those things are Levitic and they're ritual. The Levites apparently wrote down or compiled much of the biblical text. They compiled the E-text, where God is called Elohim. They compiled the D-text, which is Deuteronomy, which includes Deuteronomy, Judges, Joshua, the book of Kings, for example, and the priestly books, which is Leviticus and all kinds of other things that include the ritual material, not the J book where God is called Yahweh. That's another set of authors or author. The Levites also suffered later schisms. It seems clear from the reading between the lines in the text that the Aaronids, those that were descendants of Aaron, were prominent especially in Judah, and the Mushites, or those that were descendant from Moses, were prominent in Israel. And when the kingdom of Israel collapsed and was destroyed by Assyria, and Israelites moved south to Judah, there was a confrontation between these two priestly branches who originally emanated from the Levites, but they were already somewhat different in their practices and in their values. So this comes out between the lines, sometimes obviously in the text. Another thing that Friedman points out, and this is perhaps somewhat controversial, but he will claim with some evidence, he presents his evidence, that monotheism is already in the air, and that the Levites are pushing this, and that it already is appearing, and that lots of the other gods are falling by the wayside. It's no accident that in inscriptions that are found and seal impressions of people that run the administration of Israel and Judah, almost all the names are theophoric names that include the word El or Yahweh in them. Any name that has Ayah at the end in English, Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc., that is a Yahoo name. That comes from Ishayahu, that's a Yahweh name. So that these two are the most prominent, and very few other names occur, and certainly almost of no other gods or goddesses. So this is an indication that there's a trend towards a sort of monotheism that's happening. It's a process. Initially, for example, Yahweh has a wife. Her name is Asherah. Eventually, she is also done away with, even killed. But that's something that the Levites are also trying to make happen. And eventually it does. And part of this process is the syncretism between the Canaanite Israelite god, originally El. His name is in the name of Israel, Israel. There are lots of other names with El in them. El was the god of the Canaanites and the Israelites that resided in the southern Levant. They were there all the time. When Yahweh is a southern god, Yahweh may come from Midian. That's why Moses is spending so much time there. He learns about Yahweh when he's there and then goes back to Egypt, according to the story, and then brings Yahwehism with him from the south via Egypt into Israel. And part of what the Levites did is they pushed this syncretism and made El and Yahweh one. Sort of the same way that Zeus became Jupiter in the transition between the Greeks and the Romans. So it's the same God, essentially. That was part of the process. So you'll have to be your own judges about that scenario. It's quite controversial. Not everybody buys it. It's quite fascinating. I just want to throw in something right here, and that is that at Tel Dan, the site where I work, there are huge numbers of Egyptian cooking pots, starting from about 1200 BC, going all the way up to about 950 BC. The people that are cooking at Dan have the local kind of cooking pots, but lots and lots of these too. It's the only site in Israel that has so many Egyptian-style cooking pots and where they last so long. Dan was a key ritual site. It was a cultic center, especially in the later Iron Age period. What the connection is, I'm not sure. I wonder, maybe there were Levites living there and stayed there for a long time. I don't know. I'll leave it as an open question. The conquest of Canaan by Joshua and the Israelites is not part of the Levite story. It's its own story. It belongs to someone else, to the Israelites that were already there, and perhaps other peoples that had come into the land of Israel from the north and from the east, and people that were local from time immemorial. This is not the Levite story. And that is why the Merneptah stone is an early document from the late 13th century BC. It has nothing to do with the Levites. This is something that was happening before the Levites had left, probably. So the third explanation, as suggested by scholars such as Knoll and Frieden, by the way there are a couple others that have suggested this, is that the Exodus is an expatriate Levite experience that was later adopted by the rest of Israel as their own story. A lot of this material is collected in a book that was edited by Tom Levy, Tom Snyder, and William Propp in 2015, where they brought together in San Diego Egyptologists, biblical historians, and archaeologists to put out all kinds of papers and articles about different aspects of the Exodus story to see if they could get to something a little bit more in the way of consensus. And I think that it was, for the most part, quite successful. And I would say that right now, we can say that the fourth explanation may be the best one so far, and that is that the Exodus story is an amalgamation of stories of Egyptian oppression that took place in different venues at different time periods and suffered by different people. And that this amalgamation was then adopted by everyone and was an essential part of the nation building, people building process of the people of Israel coming together. So what is the emerging consensus as far as I can tell? And I think there is one. First of all, to get at what really happened regarding the Exodus story, you need the input of different disciplines who share their insights with each other. No one discipline can go at it by themselves because you'll just come out looking foolish. Some kind of Exodus, or exoduses in plural, did happen. The biblical story is a compendium of traumatic interactions with Egypt. That's why it resonated with everybody that told the story or heard the story. They could adapt it to their own collective memory. The Levites were central actors in the story and its subsequent transmission, no matter what exact spin you take on this. The narrative and the commemoration took hold and became canon in the Iron Age of Israel and Judah as early as the 9th century, certainly by the 8th century BC. And this commemoration, this meal even, has been with us since the 9th or 8th century BC. So this is one of maybe the world's oldest holiday, I don't know. And with that, I'll wish you Chag Sameach and Happy Easter for those of you who celebrate Easter. And by the way, there's a connection between Easter and Passover. And once again, Chag Sameach, Happy Liberation Day. Thank you. Okay, I'm not hearing everything. Okay, so I see there's a bunch of questions. And let's see if I can get to that.
David, would you like me to read the questions for you?
Okay, I think I just got to remember where to get at them. Question and answer. Okay, is that it?
Yes.
Okay. But why am I not seeing them?
David, why don't I just read them to you?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, the first one is from Marcia. She wrote, if the Israelites were nomadic, living in tents, wouldn't it be expected that they wouldn't leave archaeological evidence?
Okay, that's a great question. A lot of discussion took place in the 1980s and 90s exactly about that. One of the scholars involved, Israel Finkelstein, wrote a whole book about the ancient Israelites, and he claimed that you don't see Israelite settlements in the hill country in the late Bronze Age because they were nomadic, and that's why you're not finding them. But then other scholars, especially those from Ben Gurion University in the Negev, did a lot of research about nomads in the desert and said, sometimes you won't find evidence of nomads, but for 40 years, 2 million people, you're going to find something somewhere. You're going to find a fireplace. You're going to find a circle of stones, a little bit of pottery. You're going to be able to carbon-14 date the carbon from the ash pit. There's going to be something somewhere. There's no way that there can be nothing nowhere. And that is also based on ethnographic research. So there's no way that even if people were nomadic, they wouldn't have left absolutely nothing, zero.
Okay. Here's our next question. It's from Lauren Cobb. In this period, why is the Hittite tribe located so far away from Hattusa and the rest of the Hittite Empire?
I'm assuming that you mean the Hittite tribe in the Hebrew Bible. And that's a very interesting question also. Part of what the Egyptians did following the great battle at Kadesh between the Hittites and Egypt is that they took mercenaries or professional soldiers from all over the ancient world and hired them to be the soldiers in the places that they held, especially in the Levant. So Hittites at this point were probably professional soldiers working under the Egyptian crown in the southern Levant. Now, once the Egyptians left, the Hittites and the Girgashites and people from Syria and Cyprus, they were still there. They hadn't left. They had probably intermarried local women, and they had families. And maybe the kids of those mixed families were also called Hittites, even though just their father was the Hittite. And so it might be that Hittites were still in the land, the remnant of those that had come to serve Egypt, and that's who we hear about in the Bible.
Great. Elizabeth Barraquette had a follow-up question to the previous question about finding archaeological evidence in the desert since they were wandering. She wanted to know if the Israelites were only eating manna, they wouldn't need to cook anything.
Well, you could, if you assume that they only ate manna, fine, but the manna was produced at a time when they couldn't find anything else. It doesn't say that there was never any food for the entire 40 years. We're just hearing about a particular event where there wasn't enough food and they were really desperate, and then the miracle happens. But it doesn't say they weren't eating anything except manna for the whole 40 years. In fact, if you're carrying out a sacrifice in the desert, then there's going to be meat, and somebody's going to eat the meat too. So one doubts that they were only eating manna. And of course, there's always the option of saying what it says in the text is what happened and nothing else matters. And that's what a lot of people go by. So there's no arguing with that.
Okay, I think we have this maybe as a comment or a question. It's from Sidney Fox. He writes, interesting that Manetho says that Moses led people from the city of the sun god, or the city of On or Heliopolis.
Right. Now, so, but the thing is that Heliopolis or On is the city of the sun god who is Amun-Ra, not Aten. So there could have been something that was garbled in there, certainly, but that is what Manetho says, yes. Anything else? Okay.
I've got one more, David.
Yes.
Let me see. It was in the chat. Hold on. This is from Marin. The Exodus is an amalgamation of Egyptian oppression to different people in different parts of the world and adopted by everyone. I think she was quoting you. This feels so relevant today. Are there ties we could make to capitalism and where this system lands us today?
I think this is exactly why Exodus and the Passover is such an important part of the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, but also there's a message here, a universal message for everyone. And that is that that freedom is an essential human value, and that freedom is something that you fight for. And even if you have to leave and go somewhere else to be free, you will do that. And there are also repercussions. If you don't treat people, especially foreigners or immigrants, these people can contribute a great deal to your society. They can also be difficult if they're not part of the sharing of a society. And if you ignore that, then you're in trouble. And I think that is why the Exodus story has resonated for thousands of years, and not just for Jews. I think there's something here for everybody.
Thank you, David. I'll turn it over to Joy.
Thank you. Happy holiday. Chag Sameach.
Thank you, David, for this fascinating presentation and for sharing this timeless human value of freedom with us tonight. And thank you all for being here. Hopefully you'll join us again this Sunday, April 5th at 4 p.m. for a talk back on Fiddler, A Miracle of Miracles with Catherine Bernheimer. And on May 11th, again, when David Ilan will join us in discussing the politics of archaeology in Israel. We'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to both of these upcoming presentations. And please let us know if you have any questions or concerns. I look forward to hearing from you and to staying connected, safe, and healthy. Good night, everyone. Thank you again, David.
Thank you.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.